You are watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the director of the Demos think tank, Mackenzie, and the Telegraph's assistant comment editor, Madeline Grant. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. With the headline, Boris's Wine Time Fridays, the Mirror breaks the news that end-of-week drinking sessions were a regular feature at Downing Street during lockdown. Perhaps fittingly, a cabinet minister speaking anonymously to the Telegraph describes the Prime Minister as being in the last chance saloon. The FT describes Mr Johnson's future as hanging by a thread. The Eye reports that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, are poised to launch Conservative leadership bids. The Telegraph suggests the Prime Minister will aim to stage a political comeback by scrapping Plan B COVID restrictions. The Express comes to the defence of the Queen over allegations two parties were held at number 10 the night before Prince Philip's funeral. The Sun has word of Boris Johnson's apology to the Queen over the matter. As well as that angle, The Guardian focuses on the anger the matter has caused at Tory grassroots level. The Star pleads, will Beth Bozo's flunkies caught having a lockdown party please turn out the lights? Will the last of Bozo's flunkies caught having a lockdown party please turn out the lights? And the Mail carries images of Sir Keir Starmer with what appears to be a bottle of beer in his hand, which the paper alleges were taken at a work party in April last year. A Labour spokesperson has insisted Sir Keir was working in the office of a fellow MP and had paused for dinner. And by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers as they come in. And we're joined tonight by Mackenzie and Madeline Grant. Welcome to you both. Good evening. Let's start with the Mirror and that headline that we've been running this evening, Boris's Wine Time Fridays, suggesting something of a culture within Westminster. Polly.
Well, this is another story by Pippa Crerar at the Mirror, who has kind of led the way on so many of these Partygate scandals. In some way, I think this is probably the smallest of the stories, in that informally having a glass of wine at your desk is completely different kind of scale than some of the bigger parties in the garden that we've heard about. And yet I think it's really fascinating, the outrage that this is triggered. And the fact that it's coming out as another scandal tells you quite a lot about what's going on in Downing Street at the moment, and I think the public mood about this. If it was just a question of some people in Downing Street have a glass of wine at the end of the week, where they're working very hard, often quite late, even on a Friday night, a bit like us, for example, I don't think that's massively controversial. But the reality is that this was doing it during a pandemic where every other workplace in the land, including workplaces where people were still having to go into work, schools or hospitals or distribution facilities, they were changing their behaviour. Common rooms were closed, staff rooms were closed. And what's extraordinary about these revelations is that none of the behaviour which you might think was kind of fine in normal times changed in number 10, the very source of those rules. And again, just final thought is the reality is for staff in number 10 at the moment who are thinking, is Boris Johnson going to survive? What's the future for my job? Should I leak more information? What are my tactics here? Again, it's clear that the incentives to put more information out are there because, you know, more and more information is getting to journalists.
Madeline, the article points to the fact that the Prime Minister regularly popped in to see workers and actually was encouraging them to let off steam.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, and also what Polly just said, it really taps into, I found the story particularly annoying, even though in itself it's perhaps not the biggest example. Because if, you know, putting aside the hypocrisy for 1 second, and there's plenty of hypocrisy to go around, the thing that really got me is that clearly boozing after work with people that you've been spending the whole day with carries very little health risk. You've already been working alongside them. The Prime Minister knew this. He went in and encouraged them to do it. The people in Downing Street knew this perfectly well, and they acted accordingly. But they lacked sufficient respect for the public to let them also make that same calculation. The rules were far more rigorous than clearly they thought was rational, because their rational behaviour shows that shows what they thought of things. The ability to exercise your judgment as a rational adult. So it's clear that many of these rules that were imposed on us were illogical and stupid, and also that the people making them knew this perfectly well and kept imposing them anyway. So there is a kind of super patronising element of this story that gets me, I guess, above and beyond the kind of material facts of the drinking itself.
Yes, and the other revelation tonight, as detailed on the front page of The Star, is the former COVID task force head admitting that she too attended a rule-breaking party, a leaving party for herself. Polly?
One of Boris Johnson's defences at Prime Minister's Questions this week was that when he went to this gathering in the garden, he didn't really know it was a party, thought it was a work event, couldn't possibly understand exactly the details of the rules or the guidance. And sort of, I have like a microscopic quantity of sympathy for that opinion, but only microscopic, because, he is the Prime Minister. He ought really to pay attention, but nevertheless, he's not really a details guy. By contrast, the head of the COVID task force in number 10 was the person literally running the team, typing out these regulations, deciding the guidance and coordinating that. And yet she herself either didn't understand the regulations, didn't understand what the rules said, or, to Madeline's point, didn't really care. And, some people will believe that Madeline's right, and actually the rules were too draconian. Others will believe that the rules were fine and they were appropriate at a time when our knowledge was less about this disease. Perfectly rational people will have both of those positions. What's not rational is to have both of those positions at the same time. You cannot believe that they were the right rules and that the people setting them shouldn't have to stick with them.
And now it is the fight back against all of these revelations, and the Telegraph suggesting that the Prime Minister will scrap Plan B and get rid of further restrictions as a means of getting people back on side. Is that going to work, Madeline?
I mean, it will take a lot to get people back on side. But I suppose as part of a kind of initial rehabilitation strategy, ditching COVID regulations is a good place to start, ditching COVID passports and the work from home guidance. I think that they could go a lot further than just what they've been doing here. They could do things like an amnesty for all the fines and erasing some of the criminal records of people who were actually caught by the COVID rules that we now know that the people in charge were breaking all the time. And, I think it is an attempt to connect with the grassroots, because there have been some, and also the rest of the party, there have been some very powerful interventions from people like Lord Frost, calling for the party to kind of reclaim its identity as the party of freedom and enterprise. And obviously it's been very much overlooked in, all the completely justified fury about the number 10 parties. But I think what this story, not a party, sadly, slightly alludes to is that, the removal of restrictions around this time could have been a massive victory for the Prime Minister. Back in December, every man and his dog was clamouring seemingly for more restrictions. Everyone from, Sage, the Labour Party, and some of the modelling and the predictions that coming out of places like Imperial and Warwick University were, truly apocalyptic. And the Cabinet, quite sensibly, it now appears, decided to go against this wall of criticism to open up. And were it not for the absolute terrible own goals and the leakings and the terrible calamity for the number 10 comms machine, the period now, I think, would be a time where a lot of people are taking stock. And, this could have been a period in which, it would have come across like a real victory for the Prime Minister. But, this is, I think, an underappreciated way in which the last couple of weeks have been disastrous for number 10.
The Daily Express is suggesting that the Prime Minister should personally apologise to the Queen. That's over the party on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral. Polly.
Yeah, I think it's really quite significant that the Express, who over the course of this week have really backed Boris and said, don't let Brexit slip away because of this. Let's get him through this. And just yesterday ran an article saying that actually it was all a Remainer conspiracy, all of this hating on Boris. For the Express to then turn on him in defence of Her Majesty the Queen and suggest that the apology which was conveyed to her today was insufficient and he should go and grovel in person from a safe distance whilst wearing a mask, perhaps, is really quite significant. I mean, I happen to agree with the Express that to have behaved in such a way is unacceptable. I'm not sure an apology gets very far. The reality is that for a Prime Minister to be taken seriously by our Queen, who has seen some really extraordinary Prime Ministers in her time, I think what you need to do is somehow go back in time and not have done this, not have led a party culture in Number 10 through one of the greatest crises of our era.
Madeline, just a few seconds for you to contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the Queen, the way that the Queen has handled everything throughout the pandemic and the sacrifices that she has made, just form such a kind of jarring and awkward contrast with the kind of self-serving and duplicitous behaviour that we've seen from Number 10, and the ability to, simply be straight with people, even when bad things that come out into the public eye.
Let's have a look at the Mail, and this article focusing on Sir Keir Starmer, who's obviously been very critical of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and parties that he may have attended in the Downing Street garden, but wasn't sure whether it was a party or not. They're accusing Sir Keir Starmer of hypocrisy because he's photographed here having a drink during lockdown with colleagues. This is from April 2021. Polly.
Well, what's interesting is, normally the papers don't like to run each other's stories, but this is a photograph that first ran in The Sun in May 2021, so relatively soon after. It's clear what the Mail is doing here, though, Keir Starmer has answered these allegations, as is completely appropriate, and it does appear that he indeed is drinking in the office with some of his colleagues. But it wasn't a massive blow-up scandal in the way that these series of, what are we on now, 17 possible parties that happened in the Downing Street and kind of surrounding estate. It didn't blow up when it was in The Sun in May. It's clear, I'm not quite sure why, what the Mail is doing. They're trying to, spread the hatred, really, so that it's about all politicians. I think, it's not actually news. It's a tactic. And it's a pretty transparent one.
Madeline, do you think this story has any legs at all? Do you think people will address it with fresh eyes?
Well, I think it's a fair point to make because Labour have used exactly the same excuse. I'm not saying that it's sort of exactly the same magnitude. I think what the government did was far worse, not least because they were more involved in actually making the rules. But Labour used the same excuse that the government did, that these were work-related drinks, hence the call of hypocrisy. And I mean, I think that is fair because I've seen a lot in the last few days. The Labour Party have been busily pointing out the barbarity of the rules and saying, how could the government be so hypocritical? And fair enough, the rules were completely barbaric, but Labour also voted them through and very often called for harsher rules and longer lockdowns than even the government were doing. So I do find the recent sort of Damascene conversion to the inhumanity of lockdown actually quite hypocritical and quite hard to buy into.
Polly, we've just got time to go to The Guardian, and the Djokovic drama continues on his second appeal this evening.
This is just endlessly fascinating, this story, because it has flipped a whole bunch of, Guardianistas who are now in favour of very strict border controls to punish Djokovic for not having a vaccine. Meanwhile, we've had, Nigel Farage and others in favour of allowing anyone who wants to go to Australia, seemingly to go to Australia, and suddenly being opposed to strict border controls. Novak Djokovic has a last-ditch appeal, but if he loses that, he will be deported. And that may even result in a ban on returning to Australia for a number of years.
And Madeline, very quickly, one of the reasons the government is saying that he should be deported is because they believe his presence could excite anti-vaxxers.
Well, yeah, that's a great example of how the Australian government's position is shifting depending on what's expedient, because the initial justification was about visa requirements, and then they got the wrong answer from the federal court. So they had to reposition it as an anti-vax thing. And I think they have a real problem on their hands, because if Djokovic does play on Monday, there will be a massive backlash from the Australian citizens who are overwhelmingly opposed to him. But if he doesn't, there will also be calls that an unbalanced draw, of unfairness and so on. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens, because I think in a way they're following public opinion very much, but they've also created something of a rod for their own backs here.
Yeah, indeed it will. Thank you both. Good to see you.